The party was already loud before the sun went down. Expensive cars filled the long driveway, their engines quiet but their presence loud. Inside the large house, lights glowed warm over marble floors, tall glass windows, and art that most people would only see in magazines. Everything about the place said money, power, and control. The waitress arrived with the catering team just before the guests. She wore a simple black uniform, clean and pressed, with her hair tied back neatly. Nothing about her stood out, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She checked the table settings, counted glasses, and listened carefully as the team leader gave instructions. Serve with a smile. Speak only when needed. Move fast. Do not draw attention. She nodded and went to work. As guests began to arrive, the noise grew. Laughter echoed through the rooms. People greeted each other with loud voices and confident smiles. They spoke about business deals, travel plans, and things that sounded important. The waitress moved quietly between them, offering drinks and small plates. She kept her eyes lowered and her steps light. To most people, she was invisible. The host of the party watched everything from the center of the room. He was a man used to being noticed. People leaned in when he spoke. They laughed at his jokes, even the ones that were not funny. His clothes were perfectly fitted, and his voice carried across the space without effort. He enjoyed being in control, especially in front of others. At first, he did not notice the waitress. He was busy greeting guests and showing off the house. But as the night went on, something about her caught his eye. It was not her face or her uniform. It was the way she moved, calm, careful, almost distant. While others rushed or looked nervous, she stayed steady. Even when guests spoke sharply or waved her over without looking at her. He watched her from across the room as she placed a glass gently on a table and stepped back without a sound. There was no fear in her posture, no need to impress. That quiet confidence annoyed him in a way he could not explain. He called one of the staff members closer and spoke in a low voice. He asked where the catering team was from, how they were chosen, and if any of them had interesting stories. The staff member shrugged and said they were hired for the night, nothing special. But then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that the quiet waitress had once studied music. Piano, he thought, or something like that. The host raised an eyebrow. Music. He glanced toward the far end of the house, where a grand piano stood under soft lights. It was there mostly for show. It had been played only a few times, usually by guests who wanted attention. The idea formed quickly in his mind, and the corner of his mouth lifted into a smile. Meanwhile, the waitress continued working, unaware of the eyes on her. She had learned long ago how to disappear in crowded rooms. Life had taught her that staying quiet kept her safe. As she moved through the party, memories stayed locked deep inside her. A different room, a smaller piano, long hours of practice, dreams she no longer allowed herself to think about. She pushed those thoughts away and focused on her task. As the evening grew later, the guests became louder. Drinks flowed freely. Music played in the background, though few people listened to it. The host stepped into the center of the room and raised his glass. The noise slowly faded as people turned toward him. He thanked everyone for coming and spoke about success, effort, and enjoying life. His words were smooth and confident. People nodded and clapped at the right moments. Then his eyes shifted, and he smiled in a way that made a few guests curious. He gestured toward the piano. He joked about how music brought people together and how talent could be found in the most unexpected places. Some guests laughed, thinking he was setting up a performance. Then he pointed toward the waitress. The room went quiet. She froze where she stood, a tray in her hands. At first, she thought she had done something wrong. She looked around, confused, as all eyes turned toward her. Her face warmed, and her heart began to beat faster. The host spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. He said he had learned that the waitress could play the piano. He suggested it would be fun for everyone to hear her play something simple. Just for entertainment, he said. Nothing serious. Laughter spread through the room. Some guests smiled with interest. Others looked at her with curiosity mixed with doubt. A few whispered to each other. The idea of a waitress playing piano at a rich party seemed funny to them. The waitress shook her head gently and took a step back. She said she was there to work and that she was not prepared to perform. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the tray. The host waved his hand as if brushing away her words. He said it was no trouble, that everyone would enjoy it. He reminded her that it was his house and his party. His tone stayed polite, but the message was clear. She felt the weight of the room pressing in on her. Saying no felt dangerous. Saying yes felt terrifying. Memories rushed forward without warning. The sound of keys. The pressure to be perfect. The pain of letting go. She swallowed and stood still, unsure what to do. Some guests encouraged her, calling out that it would be fun. Others watched closely, waiting for what would happen next. The host smiled, certain that he was in control of the moment. To him, it was just a small joke, a way to show his power and entertain his guests. The waitress looked at the piano. It looked bigger than she remembered. The bench seemed too far away. Her feet felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the floor. For a brief moment, she considered walking out, but she stayed. She slowly set the tray down and took a step forward. Her movements were careful, almost unsure, but her face remained calm. As she walked toward the piano, whispers followed her. Some guests leaned forward. Others smirked, already expecting a mistake. The host stepped back, leaving her space, satisfied with himself. He believed he had turned her into a lesson, a reminder of where people belonged. She reached the piano and paused. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, not touching them yet. The room felt different now, quieter, heavier. She took a deep breath. And in that moment, before a single note was played, the room was silent now, but the silence was heavy. All eyes were on the waitress as she sat at the piano. The host leaned back slightly, confident that the next few moments would amuse the guests. Some of them whispered to each other, imagining a clumsy performance or a nervous mistake. They did not notice the tiny tremble in her hands, the brief hesitation before she touched the keys, or the deep breath she took to steady herself. She looked down at the piano keys. They were familiar yet distant. It had been years since she had played in front of anyone other than her old teacher. The grand piano in front of her seemed to hum with its own expectation. Her heart pounded, and a cold sweat broke on her forehead. She felt the weight of the crowd, the laughter, and the host's smirk pressing down on her. For a moment, she imagined turning away, leaving the room, and escaping back to the kitchen where she belonged. But something stronger held her in place. She could not let fear decide. The thought of showing them even a glimpse of her true self, of her talent, pushed her forward. It was a quiet, stubborn spark inside her that refused to be ignored. The guests shifted, leaning closer. Some raised their glasses. A few snickers escaped, but most were curious now, watching the small, nervous woman who was about to play in front of an audience that expected her to fail. The host's smile was wider now, certain of the coming spectacle. His eyes shone with amusement and superiority. She placed her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment. Memories of long hours at the piano returned. Early mornings when the sun had barely risen. Evenings filled with scales and exercises. The pride of hitting every note correctly. And the frustration of making even the smallest mistake. She remembered the music, the flow, and the feeling of becoming lost in sound. That was where she felt free. That was where she had been herself. Slowly, she pressed the first key. The sound filled the room softly, almost hesitantly. There were a few surprised whispers. The host laughed lightly, thinking it was a timid start. But as her fingers moved, she found the rhythm and the melody began to flow. The notes were simple at first, but precise, clean, and surprisingly confident. The room's energy shifted. Laughter faded, curiosity deepened, and the guests leaned forward to listen. She felt herself slipping into the music, as if the piano had become an extension of her body. Her nervousness melted away with each note, replaced by focus and clarity. Her fingers danced over the keys with an elegance and skill that no one expected. The melody grew, filling every corner of the room. It was not showy or dramatic. It was honest and pure, a simple tune that carried emotion, warmth, and depth. People began to stop talking, drawn into the sound. The host's expression changed slowly. His smirk disappeared. He had expected embarrassment, but he was seeing something else. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in amusement, but in disbelief. The woman he had thought would fail was commanding the room with her music. Guests were whispering now, not mockingly, but in astonishment. They were trying to place her. Where had they seen such talent before? How could someone so young and unassuming play like this? The waitress did not notice the crowd. She had closed her eyes again, letting the music guide her. She remembered her teacher's words, her parents' encouragement, and the joy she had felt when the piano had first begun. Come, her friend. She let the melody tell the story she had kept locked inside for years. The struggle, the hope, the silent determination that had carried her this far. Each note was a piece of herself, shared in a way words never could. Some guests were moved almost to tears. Others clutched their glasses, feeling a quiet awe. The sound was unexpected, unpretentious, yet completely masterful. The host shifted in his seat, uncomfortably aware that his plan had failed. The room was no longer under his control. The attention had shifted, and he could do nothing but watch. Whispers spread across the room. One guest asked another, "Who taught her?" Another whispered, "I didn't know she could play like this." Some were silent, simply taking in the music, not wanting to interrupt the moment. The waitress, focused on the piano, did not hear their words. She was deep in her own world, yet completely present, sharing herself without pretense. As she played, the energy in the room changed. The host's laughter was gone. His voice, once the loudest in the room, was now just another sound among the music. The guests were no longer there to be impressed by wealth or status. They were there to witness a talent that demanded respect. The performance was not long, but it was enough to shift the balance in the room entirely. Finally, she slowed, finishing with a gentle flourish. The last note hung in the air for a moment before fading. There was a pause, a brief silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. Then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. Hands clapped, feet stomped lightly on the floor. Some guests stood, some smiled in disbelief. Many were shaking their heads, amazed that a simple waitress could produce something so beautiful, so moving. The host's face was red. He cleared his throat and smiled awkwardly, trying to regain control. Some guests exchanged knowing glances, enjoying the subtle shift of power. They saw the pride, the skill, and the courage it took for her to play in front of them. The host could no longer dictate the room's attention. For the first time that night, he was not the center of admiration. The waitress slowly opened her eyes. She felt a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. She had survived the scrutiny, shared her gift, and most importantly, reclaimed a part of herself that had been hidden for too long. She had not played to impress or please anyone except herself, and yet the impact was undeniable. The room, filled with wealthy and powerful people, had stopped and listened. They had respected her. She stood quietly, accepting the applause with a modest nod. Her hands still hovered near the piano, trembling slightly, but her heart felt strong. She had done more than play music. She had transformed the moment, and in doing so, had shown that talent and courage were not determined by appearance, occupation, or status. The guests continued to speak, some approaching her with admiration, others asking questions about her music. The host looked on, trying to smile, but his earlier confidence was gone. He had planned to embarrass her, to show his guests that a simple waitress was out of her place. Instead, she had taken control of the room with nothing but her skill, her determination, and her quiet bravery. For the waitress, the night had changed. She returned to her duties, but the difference was noticeable. She moved with a new confidence, a quiet pride that came from being seen and respected for who she truly was. Guests now looked at her differently. They treated her with kindness, curiosity, and admiration. They asked her questions, listened to her words, and acknowledged her presence in a way they had not before. The host, meanwhile, tried to reassert his authority, but the room had shifted. His wealth and status could not erase the impression she had made. He had underestimated her, and the lesson was clear. Respect cannot be forced, and talent will shine even when others try to suppress it. The waitress cleaned tables, refilled drinks, and moved among the guests with her usual efficiency, but now with a sense of calm power. She had faced a challenge she had never expected and had emerged not only unscathed but victorious. Her music had spoken for her, and in that voice she found strength that while after the applause died down, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The guests who had once seen her as a simple waitress now looked at her with admiration. They whispered to one another, trying to understand who she really was. Some of them had expected a joke, a moment of entertainment at her expense, but instead they had witnessed a performance that was sincere, skilled, and full of emotion. The energy in the room had shifted, and no one, not even the host, could ignore it. The host, who had been confident and amused just moments before, was now uneasy. His plan to humiliate the waitress had backfired. He had assumed he controlled the situation, but in reality, it was she who had taken control. Her music had done what no words or gestures could. It commanded respect. His face was red with embarrassment, and he tried to regain his composure. But the room no longer responded to him the way it had at the beginning of the evening. The waitress returned to her work, but there was a subtle change in how she moved. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps lighter, and her head held higher. She felt a quiet pride that came from proving herself, not to the guests, but to herself. She had faced fear, performed under pressure, and come out with dignity intact. Every action she took now carried the confidence of someone who had been underestimated and had shown her true worth. Guests began approaching her, complimenting her performance. Some asked where she had learned to play. Others wanted to know if she still performed regularly. She answered politely, keeping her responses simple but honest. She spoke about her training in her youth and how she had put music aside to focus on other responsibilities. The guests listened intently, their curiosity genuine. They were intrigued by the contrast between her humble appearance and extraordinary talent. The host tried to interject, attempting to steer the conversation back to himself. He made light jokes, trying to recover the laughter and attention that had once been his. But the guests were no longer interested in his words. Their focus remained on the waitress, who had become the center of admiration without seeking it. The shift in attention was clear and undeniable. She moved among the guests, serving drinks and answering questions, but she felt a new sense of self. The music had not just captivated the room, it had changed her own perception of herself. For years, She had hidden her talent, believing it was not for her, believing it could not exist alongside her daily life. Tonight, she realized that her skills, her dedication, and her voice mattered. They had power, even in a room filled with wealth and influence. The host, meanwhile, was left to reflect. He had attempted to assert dominance, to remind everyone of their social hierarchy. But the very act he intended to humiliate had highlighted someone else's strength. He watched as guests engaged with the waitress, asking thoughtful questions and offering praise. His own laughter, once so easy and certain, now felt forced and hollow. A few guests were so impressed that they suggested she play again, this time for a smaller group in a more intimate setting. She smiled gently, refusing politely, but the respect in their eyes was unmistakable. They had witnessed talent in its purest form, and that left an impression that money, status, or pretense could never achieve Dot in the kitchen. Her coworkers watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. They had seen her perform countless times when no one else was watching, but to see it recognized publicly was different. They nodded quietly to one another, proud of her and grateful to have worked alongside someone so talented. The air of camaraderie and mutual respect was refreshing in a place that often overlooked the efforts of its staff. The music had done more than entertain. It had revealed layers of character, resilience, and courage that words could not convey. It reminded the guests that talent and strength are not always visible, and that assumptions based on appearance or position can be misleading. The waitress had not sought recognition, yet she had earned it in the most authentic way. As the night progressed, more people approached her, not to test her, but to genuinely connect. They asked about her training, her inspirations, and the journey that had brought her to that point. Each answer she gave was met with interest and respect. The conversations were natural, warm, and engaging, a sharp contrast to the earlier laughter and casual dismissals. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. From the host to the waitress, not through confrontation or argument, but through talent and authenticity. The host tried one last time to regain control, suggesting a toast to the evening, but the guests politely diverted their attention elsewhere. They were captivated by the genuine moments they had witnessed. They were moved by the courage it took to perform under pressure and the beauty that emerged from sincerity. The host's voice, which had once dominated the room, was now just another sound in the background. For the waitress, the experience was transformative. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Her performance had been a risk, one that could have ended in embarrassment, but she had trusted her skill and her preparation. The result was a moment of connection, respect, and recognition that transcended social barriers. As the party drew toward its later hours, the energy in the room remained different. Guests mingled with a sense of humility and curiosity, acknowledging each other's talents and stories. The host had become quieter, more reflective, and more aware of the limits of his influence. The waitress moved among them, serving and interacting with the same professionalism she always had, but now with a presence that could not be ignored. She thought about the piano, about the music that had carried her through the night. Each note had been a declaration of her identity, a statement of skill and resilience. The applause and admiration were gratifying, but the true victory was the confidence she had reclaimed and the respect she had earned without seeking it. It was a reminder that authenticity, talent, and courage could not be manufactured, and that they spoke louder than status or wealth. Even after the music had stopped, the effect lingered. Guests spoke of the performance for hours, recounting the emotion and precision, the humility and strength of the woman who had captured their attention so completely. The host watched, a little humbler, as people he had assumed would entertain him became the center of their own narrative. His understanding of power had shifted, and the lesson was undeniable. Respect must be earned. And talent can never be underestimated. By the end of the night, the waitress returned to her tasks with a sense of peace and accomplishment. She had faced the challenge, shared her gift, and emerged with dignity. The music had been more than performance. It had been revelation. It had shown her, and everyone present, that talent, courage, and integrity could shine even in the most unlikely places. The party would be remembered not for the wealth on display, but for the quiet, powerful presence of a young woman who refused to be diminished and chose to shine. Carry her far beyond this night. Everything was about to change. The night was deepening, but the atmosphere in the house had transformed completely. The earlier excitement and laughter had given way to a quieter, more reflective energy. Guests were still talking, but now it was with curiosity and genuine interest rather than amusement or casual chatter. Many returned to the areas near the piano, hoping to catch another glimpse of the young woman whose performance had completely changed the tone of the evening. The waitress moved through the room, serving drinks and cleaning tables, but she felt no fear or hesitation now. Each step she took carried a new confidence, born from the courage it had taken to sit at the piano and perform despite the host's attempts to embarrass her. Her hands no longer trembled, and her back was straight. She understood now that the applause and admiration were not only for the music she had played, but also for the bravery she had shown in the act of sharing it. Some guests approached her directly, asking questions about her training and musical background. She answered with humility, explaining that she had studied piano seriously as a child, but had put it aside due to family and financial responsibilities. Her explanations were simple and honest. She did not seek praise, but it came naturally from those who listened. They were fascinated by the contrast between her quiet, unassuming presence and the remarkable skill she had demonstrated. The host, however, was growing increasingly uncomfortable. He had expected the performance to be short, amusing, and forgettable. Instead, it had become the highlight of the evening. The attention he had assumed was his by right was now focused entirely on someone he had underestimated. He realized, slowly and uncomfortably, that his attempt to dominate and control the evening had completely failed. He watched as guests spoke with her, asked for stories, and even suggested she consider performing in more formal settings. His intended lesson in hierarchy had instead become a lesson in humility. He tried to regain some sense of authority by stepping forward and announcing a toast. He smiled, attempting to make light of the situation, and spoke about the importance of entertainment, talent, and the joy of the evening. But the room no longer responded to his voice the way it had at the start of the night. People politely acknowledged him, but their attention quickly returned to the waitress, who had unknowingly become the center of the room's admiration. The host's laughter, once so easy and commanding, now sounded forced and hollow. Meanwhile, the young woman returned to the piano once more, not because anyone demanded it, but because the guests' curiosity and admiration created an unspoken invitation. She sat for a moment, letting her fingers hover above the keys, reflecting on how far she had come. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the hours of practice in small, quiet rooms, the sacrifices she had made, and the patience she had learned through difficult circumstances. It was a path that few understood, yet it had shaped her into someone capable of this moment. When she finally played again, it was not a performance aimed at impressing anyone. Instead, it was a private act of expression, a continuation of the story she had started earlier. The music flowed smoothly, carrying emotion and depth that drew the audience in without any effort on her part. The guests listened silently, enraptured by the sincerity and skill that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Their previous assumptions about her had vanished entirely. Some of the more influential guests were visibly shaken. They whispered to each other about her talent, trying to guess where she had studied and who had taught her. The realization spread that her skills were not just natural ability, but the result of dedication and hard work. For many of them, it was a reminder that wealth and status did not automatically equate to talent or character. The waitress, in her quiet way, had become a living example of how true skill and integrity could shine without any pretense. The host's unease grew with each passing minute. He had believed that controlling appearances and using his social power would dictate the narrative of the evening. Yet he could see clearly that his authority had been undermined, not through confrontation, but through the authenticity and skill of someone he had thought of as insignificant. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a quiet recognition of reality, a realization that influence and respect must be earned rather than assumed. As the night wore on, the interactions between guests and the waitress became more personal. They were not simply congratulating her on a performance. They were acknowledging her as a person, recognizing the strength it took to rise above expectation and judgment. Conversations were thoughtful, warm, and engaging, and the atmosphere in the room reflected a newfound sense of equality. People who had once assumed superiority over others were now listening, learning, and appreciating the talents that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The waitress moved through the crowd, answering questions with patience and grace. She spoke about her past experiences, her dedication to music, and the challenges she had faced in balancing her responsibilities with her passion. Her words were simple, yet they carried weight because they were genuine. Guests were inspired not just by her talent, but by her courage, humility, and unwavering sense of self. Even the host could no longer ignore the impact she had made. He observed quietly as she interacted with the guests, their faces lighting up with interest and admiration. He had intended to embarrass her, but she had instead earned something far more valuable: genuine respect. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by a thoughtful, almost reluctant acknowledgement of her strength. The night had revealed a truth he could not change. The power of talent, courage, and authenticity transcends status and wealth. By the end of the evening, the young woman had become more than just a waitress at a wealthy party. She had become a symbol of perseverance, skill, and integrity. The guests left with stories to tell, not about the grandeur of the house or the wealth of the host, but about the remarkable woman who had turned a moment of potential humiliation into a display of brilliance and character. Her presence and talent had left an indelible impression on everyone in the room. As the last guest departed and the house quieted, she reflected on the night. The experience had been challenging, yes, but it had also been transformative. She had faced fear, navigated expectations, and shared her talent in a way that had resonated deeply with those around her. She had proven, above all else, that true skill and confidence cannot be diminished by others' intentions. They exist within, waiting to emerge when courage allows. Walking back to the kitchen to collect her belongings, she felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. The applause, the admiration, and the stories told by the guests were rewarding, but they were secondary to the personal victory she had achieved. She had reclaimed her confidence, demonstrated her abilities, and most importantly, remained true to herself. The night had shifted not only the perception of the guests, but also her own understanding of her strength and potential. The host, left alone in the grand room, surveyed the aftermath of the evening. The chairs, tables, and decorations remained as they had been, but the dynamic of the night had changed irreversibly. He had attempted to assert control, but in doing so, had revealed his own limitations. The young waitress had reminded everyone present, including him, that talent, courage, and authenticity carry a weight and influence far greater than wealth or status. It was a lesson he would not forget. And for the young woman, the night had solidified an understanding that would stay with her forever. True strength is not in avoiding challenges, but in facing them with honesty and skill. Her journey as a pianist and as an individual had gained new momentum, And the experience at the party had marked a turning point. The world had seen her for who she really was, and she had done it without compromise, without pretense, and without fear. The night was finally coming to an end. Guests had begun to leave, carrying with them the memory of an evening unlike any they had experienced before. The grand house, once buzzing with laughter, chatter, and the energy of wealth, now felt quieter and more reflective. The young waitress moved calmly through the space, cleaning and arranging what remained, her heart steady and her mind clear. She had faced a challenge that could have been humiliating, yet she had emerged with strength, dignity, and recognition. Throughout the night, she had learned more about herself than she had expected. Her talent had been acknowledged by those who had previously dismissed her as just another server. The applause, the admiration, and the curiosity of the guests had given her something that no amount of money or praise could replace: the affirmation of her own value and capability. She had shown that her skills were not limited by circumstance, that her courage could shine even under pressure, and that authenticity could overcome social hierarchies. As she moved toward the kitchen, she overheard guests discussing her performance. Some were still speaking in hushed tones about the grace and emotion in her music. Others marveled at the technical skill, the clarity of her notes, and the way she had captivated the room without any need for showiness. It was clear that her performance had left a lasting impression, one that went far beyond mere entertainment. People were talking about her courage, her poise, and her integrity. In the kitchen, her coworkers greeted her with quiet smiles and nods of respect. They had watched the events unfold from a distance, unsure of what to expect, and now they were proud to see her recognized for something they had long known. Her talent, humility, and professionalism had stood out, and for the first time it was acknowledged openly. The room felt warmer because of their pride, and for the waitress, it was comforting to know that those who truly mattered in her daily life respected her. The host, meanwhile, lingered in the main room, watching the last of the guests depart. His mind was unsettled. He had intended to dominate, to amuse himself at the expense of someone he considered insignificant. But the evening had unfolded very differently. The realization weighed on him that true influence comes not from wealth or intimidation, but from skill, courage, and authenticity. The young waitress had reminded everyone, including him, that respect must be earned, not demanded. Despite his discomfort, he could not deny the truth of what had happened. The woman he had intended to embarrass had captivated an entire room. She had done so not through manipulation, charm, or social connections, but through talent, confidence, and grace under pressure. The lesson was humbling, and he felt a mix of admiration and begrudging respect. As she prepared to leave, the waitress reflected on the night. The experience had been a turning point in her life. She had faced fear and the possibility of public humiliation, and yet she had been true to herself. The piano, the music, and the moment of performance had allowed her to reclaim a part of her identity that had been set aside for years. She realized that talent, when nurtured and embraced, could not be hidden forever. The courage to share it, even in difficult circumstances, could change how the world saw her. Walking toward the exit, she felt a sense of calm accomplishment. She had proven something to herself, that she could confront fear, perform under pressure, and remain authentic in the face of judgment. She had shown that her value was not determined by others' assumptions, that her skills and character mattered, and that courage could transform moments of potential shame into opportunities for empowerment. The guests who remained in the driveway paused to wave goodbye, some offering kind words, others expressing admiration. They had seen something extraordinary that night, something that went beyond wealth, status, and social pretense. The young woman had left a mark on everyone who witnessed her performance. Their conversations would carry her story forward, sharing not the extravagance of the party, but the quiet brilliance of someone who had risen above expectation. Even as she stepped into the cool night air, she felt a lingering sense of satisfaction. She had been tested, observed, and admired, yet she had maintained her humility and grace. Her experience was a reminder that life sometimes presents unexpected challenges, and that facing them with integrity, skill, and courage can change not just how others see us, but how we see ourselves. As she walked away from the grand house and toward the life she had built, she knew that nothing about her would ever feel small again. The applause, the admiration, and the recognition had been temporary, but the confidence and self-respect she had gained would last a lifetime. She had experienced a night that could have been humiliating, but she had transformed it into one of triumph and self-discovery. The world had seen her talent and her strength, and more importantly, she had seen it in herself. The night's events also left a lasting impression on the host. His perception of control, power, and status had shifted. He realized that influence comes not from wealth or intimidation, but from authenticity, talent, and courage. He had witnessed firsthand the impact of someone rising above expectation through skill and integrity, and it was a lesson he would not soon forget. For the young waitress, life would continue as it always had, with work, responsibilities, and the daily challenges she faced. But something inside her had changed irrevocably. She had faced fear, shared her talent, and been acknowledged for her courage and skill. The experience had reminded her of her own worth, of the value of dedication, and of the strength found in authenticity. It had been more than a performance. It had been a declaration of her identity. As she reached her small apartment, she paused for a moment, looking at the quiet streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The night had been extraordinary, a story she would carry with her forever. She had faced humiliation, risk, and fear, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. Her music had transformed a moment, changed perceptions, and reaffirmed the power of courage and authenticity. She sat quietly for a few minutes, reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the countless hours at the piano, the sacrifices made, and the quiet determination that had carried her forward. The night had not only proven her talent to others, but had reminded her of the strength she had always possessed. She had faced an unexpected challenge, and had risen to it with dignity and grace. Finally, she allowed herself a small smile, a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet joy. She knew that life would continue to present challenges, that not every situation would be as dramatic or public as tonight. But she had learned something essential, that facing fear with honesty and skill could transform a moment, a perception, and even a life. She had turned a potential humiliation into a triumph, and in doing so, had discovered a new depth of confidence and self-respect. The story of that night would stay with her forever. The applause, the admiration, and the respect she had earned would remain in her memory, not as a fleeting moment of recognition, but as a powerful reminder of her own abilities. She had been seen, she had been heard, as she had proven that courage, talent, and authenticity could change the world, even in the smallest and most unexpected ways. As she finally lay down to rest, the music from the piano lingered in her mind, a gentle echo of the evening's events. It was a reminder of the courage it took to share her gift, the respect she had earned, and the transformation that can occur when one embraces their true self. The night had begun with tension and the threat of embarrassment, but it ended with recognition, respect, and a renewed sense of self. She had faced fear, embraced her talent, and emerged triumphant, carrying with her a lesson that would last a lifetime.